This project started as my projects often do, which means I'm back at Vintage Reclaimed Lumber here in Oklahoma City, picking through these live edge cutoffs to make epoxy floating shelves. And I selected a few pieces with interesting character and voids, including this piece of hickory and some walnut, using cutoffs that would normally just get thrown in the trash. Now let's see if we can make something beautiful out of these. Today's project was made possible by Total Boat. More on them here in a bit. With the slabs back in my shop, the first thing to do was clean up the live edge by removing the bark, which I did with a chisel and later on some sanding. Next, I marked out the portion I wanted to use for the shelf and then cut the slab down over on the miter saw. To get an even thickness on both shelves and to flatten out the pieces, I ran each side through my planer. Before pouring any epoxy, I have to build a form, and I use this piece of melamine that's been sitting around my shop for a while. The shelves are going to be 8 inches deep, so I made the form just a bit oversized so I could trim the finished shelf to width later on. Next, I cut all these pieces to length to accommodate the 3-foot shelves. I line the form with sheathing tape that's called tuck tape, and it won't stick to the epoxy while it cures, and it also makes taking the form apart later very easy. And then I pre-drilled all the holes and screwed the forms together. With the forms all done, I could cut the slabs to their final length of 36 inches and lay them out how I wanted the pieces to match up. For the hickory shelf, it will be more of a typical river style that you've likely seen before. The walnut slab was a bit more unique with this large bark inclusion, and I wanted to add this cutoff, but it didn't quite fit down into the form. I recently picked up this Arbortech Turboplane and figured this would be the perfect opportunity to try it out. The Turboplane made quick work of carving back the edge to fit, but a flat disc would also work here as well. Before pouring any epoxy, I sealed the top surface of the slabs with shellac, and this prevents the epoxy from staining the wood. This step isn't completely necessary, but it will save me some time sanding later. To hold the slabs in place within the form, I just used a few dabs of hot glue. I added some aluminum tape to this void on the bottom of the hickory slab where I'm going to add a different color of epoxy, and this way it won't bleed through. For this project, I'm using Total Boat's 2-to-1 resin with the slow hardener. I mix 2 parts of the resin to 1 part hardener, and I make sure to mix the epoxy as accurately as possible to ensure that it cures properly. Next, I added this pearl white pigment for the hickory shelf and started with the first pour. Using this 2-to-1 epoxy, it's important not to pour too deep because the chemical reaction of the resin combining with the hardener creates heat. Too deep creates too much heat and the epoxy will go exothermic, which can cause it to crack and have really bad results. Before pouring, I turned off my garage heater so my shop would be cooler, and I tried to pour no more than 1/4 inch deep. Then I could come back after an hour and do another pour and repeat this process until the void was completely filled. I used a heat gun to pop any bubbles, but it's important to use a light touch so you don't push the epoxy towards going exothermic. I mixed up another batch of epoxy and separated some out so I could add this blue and green pigment to create this turquoise color. Next, I added silicone caulk to the top of the slab to create a little dam and filled the knot holes on top of the hickory shelf. finished with my fourth and final layer of epoxy and allowed it to set up for a few minutes before coming back with a stick to add this swirl pattern. After a day, the epoxy was cured enough to begin removing the excess. I took the shelves out of the form using a chisel to release it from the bottom of the form. With both shelves out of the form, I could scrape off the silicone before sending the shelves through the planer to remove most of the excess epoxy. The walnut shelf had a bunch of smaller holes that did not get filled in the initial pours, so I used a dental syringe to get the epoxy all the way down into these voids. In order to rip a perfect straight edge on the shelf, I'm building this straight line rip jig out of some scrap plywood I had laying around. I cut these strips to serve as the fence of the jig and then cut all the pieces to length. I made sure the fence was square to the bottom board of the jig and then ripped a straight edge on both sides. I used screws to add 3 of these toggle clamps to the jig that will hold the shelves in place while I rip straight edges on both shelves. To square up and remove the excess epoxy from the ends of the shelf, I cut them over on the miter saw. Cutting off the ends revealed this void in the epoxy on the hickory shelf that needed to be filled, and these screw clamps worked great to hold the piece vertical while I filled the void with epoxy. To quickly remove the excess epoxy from the holes in the walnut shelf, I used a heat gun and this scraper. And for an edge profile, I decided to route in a 45-degree chamfer to the underside of the shelves with my palm router. While I sand the shelves up to 220 grit, it's a good time to say, if you like what you see here, please hit that subscribe button to keep up with all my upcoming projects. Thanks, everyone. The epoxy requires more polishing, so I sanded it first with 600 grit, then 1200 grit, and last 2000 grit. To mount these shelves to the wall, I'm using Rockler's floating shelf hardware. I found the stud and mounted the first side with screws. Then I measured over 32 inches to another stud and mounted the second bracket, making sure it was level with the first. The shelf brackets require a 5 1/4 inch hole to be drilled into the backs of the shelves, and the chuck on my drill press only has 3 1/4 inches of travel, so I had to come up with a solution to drill perfectly sized straight holes. So I made this homemade little drilling guide made from a scrap block and some drill bushings. I marked out the hole location on the back of the shelf and used a punch to make an indentation. I'm using this 12-inch long 7/16 drill bit, and I marked the proper depth with a piece of tape. I clamped the guide in place and started drilling the hole. Now, drilling this deep creates a lot of friction, so I had to go really slow and vacuum out the chips often. The end result was perfect though. I got accurate straight holes using this technique. Now I could place the shelf on the first bracket, and the other side has this indent punch that allows you to line up the shelf and mark exactly where you need to drill the second hole. With the second holes drilled, I could add 2 coats of this simple finish with wax, which is now my go-to finish because it's so easy. And with the finish on, I could see just how beautiful all the figure was in these live edge slab cutoffs. It would have been a real shame had these pieces of wood ended up in the trash. Last, I mounted the shelves to the wall, and this project was done. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out this project. I want to give a quick shout out to Vintage Reclaimed Lumber here in Oklahoma City for hooking me up with the wood for this project. Stop by or check them out online at vrlumber.com. And I want to give a huge thank you to the sponsor of this video and a big supporter of this channel, Total Boat. So I've been using Total Boat's 2-to-1 resin with the slow hardener for a while now, and I've had nothing but really good results with this epoxy. Some of the advantages of using Total Boat's 2-to-1 epoxy system over some of the deep pour systems that are out there are that you can actually complete a project faster than you can with a deep pour system because they're going to shut down your shop for multiple days and you have to have a completely dust-free environment. Well, Total Boat's 2-to-1 resin, you can do multiple pours over the course of a day, and you only have to wait about an hour in between pours. Total Boat's 2-to-1 resin is also very clear, with the slow hardener that I use being the most clear. So I encourage you guys to go online and check them out at totalboat.com, and you can use code JBuilds to get 20% off of every order. Again, make sure you get subscribed to this channel to stay up to date with what I got coming out next, and follow me on Instagram at JohnnyBuilds to stay up to date with more of the behind-the-scenes, day-to-day stuff. All right, everyone, thanks for checking this one out, and we'll see you back here next time.